So the topic this morning is timeless Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart was born Eckhart von Hochheim in a little place, a little wide spot in the road in Germany, in about 1260. So roughly 700 years ago, he was on the earth, and at the age of 15, he joined the Dominican priory as a novice. Became rather well known, was a professor of theology at the university in Paris on 3 different occasions. And the most important contribution that he made to the world, really, was his willingness to dive deep into himself. He was first and foremost a mystic. So he got in touch with reality through direct, conscious contact. One of the things that I learned about Meister Eckhart is that it was, we know a little bit about the Middle Ages, but it was really a very, very different time. The church was in charge, basically, of everyone's life. And it was particularly difficult to be a female in those days, because there were just really 2 choices. You either became a religious, you took the vows and became a nun, or you got married. There were very, very few opportunities for women in those days, because that's the way it was. It was a patriarchal, male-dominated society. Some would say that still is today, but it was even more so in those days. One of the things that developed in those days was a movement of women who had neither the dowry to get married or the dowry to get into a religious order, because, believe it or not, in those days, you couldn't become a nun unless you had a very substantial dowry in order to turn it over to the convent. So a lot of women got together and decided to create a movement on their own. And they became a spiritual collective. They were known as the Beguines. Originally, it was a derisive term that described this group of women. And they lived together, created a community for themselves. And Meister Eckhart became a guide to the Beguines. His work really was supportive of gender equality, and he lectured to them and taught them often. And that in itself got him in a little bit of difficulty with the church, because the church didn't really look kindly on these women who were, quote, religious, but not under the domination of the popes. And they took no vows. They simply got together and did what they did. So our friend Eckhart was really a troublemaker. One of the things that he did was that he spoke in a prophetic voice, and his sermons were really calculated to make people crazy. People in authority particularly, because he just liked to say, look, we should be treating people differently. He was the first to really articulate the ideas that we now describe as interspirituality. He was the first to articulate this. And one of the central themes in his work was that God is love, and that love is part of us. He spoke about the cave of the heart. Imagine the heart is a cave in which you reside. And he said that God was the spark of the soul. And this, of course, made the church quite uncomfortable, because they were talking about sin and guilt and, how important it was for you to do the things that the church said to do. Whereas Eckhart was saying just exactly the opposite. He was the first of the deep ecumenists. He said, God is in and on all paths, and equal in all modes. And of course, that made the church crazy. They just said, that's terrible. You can't say those things, because God's only in the Catholic Church. Didn't you know? Well, the list of people who were deeply influenced by the writings of Meister Eckhart is extraordinary, to say the least. I'm going to take about 5 minutes and read this list. No, it's not that long. Carl Jung, Karl Marx, Thomas Merton, Martin Luther, and the mystics Julian of Norwich, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, philosopher Georg Hegel, St. Ignatius of Loyola, Howard Thurman, who was an African-American spiritual creator of the civil rights movement, St. Paul of the Cross, Saul Bellow, John Updike, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, Ira Progoff, Eckhart Tolle, who literally changed his name to Eckhart based on his understanding of the importance of Meister Eckhart, Martin Buber, Jewish theologist, Martin Luther King Jr., and Dag Hammarskjöld, just to name a few. Just to name a few. Eckhart said, divinity is the great underground river that no one can dam up and no one can stop. He honored the ancient traditions of the goddess and the divine feminine, and reached out to embrace this group of women called the Beguines. In fact, on his second return to Paris, he spent time and lived in the Dominican convent where just the previous year, 1 year previously, a woman who was a Beguine named Marguerite Porret had been burned at the stake by the church because she would not recant the things that she taught. She was, of course, a mystic as well. And she was talking about the divine feminine, and it made the regular part of the church, the male-dominated part, just crazy. In fact, Eckhart lived in the convent with the inquisitor who had convicted Marguerite just a year before. That must have been a difficult thing for him to do, because he realized that Marguerite was a spiritual buddy, that they were on the same path. They had the same understanding. They knew what was true and what was not. Eckhart's sermons have been disseminated over the centuries, and they were in German, of course, because that's what he spoke of in the vernacular mostly. He had a great volume of writing that was in Latin, and that was more, academic. It was aimed at the clerics. But his sermons in German were of a prophetic voice, really impacted. Really, he suggested that we should be ecumenical, that we should be educational, we should have a strong education, we should have a deep ecological belief, we should take care of the earth. He taught as a primary belief system that one should be amazed and in awe at Mother Nature. Think, if you would, for a moment, how much fun he would have today to have a conversation with the astrophysicists of today, because we know so much more about the universe. You may not know this, but there are a number of astrophysicists who have been scientifically oriented atheists for a very long time. They had no capacity to accept that there was a creator. But now that they know so much more about the universe, they're saying, we might have been wrong. The only logical explanation for what's going on in the universe is that there is an intelligence, a creator of some sort. We know not what. Look at the mathematics of it. Back in 1966, Carl Sagan wrote an article about the Earth and planets, and he said there's only two parameters that are required to support life on this planet, and one is the sun of a particular size and brilliance, and the planet a certain distance from that sun that will support life. And those were the only two parameters that were necessary to support life. And now, 50 years later, we understand that the list of parameters has gone up, first to 10, then to 20, then to 50, and now there are over 200 parameters that must exist in order for life to be extant on a piece of rock floating around the universe somewhere. Not least of which is the necessity of having a giant planet like Jupiter near enough so that its strong gravitational pull will attract all of the asteroids to it instead of them coming and crashing into us. Because if we didn't have Jupiter nearby, we'd have 10,000 times as many asteroids as we do striking the Earth's atmosphere. And it might make life a little difficult. So, in that realm, the number of planets that would support life have gone from a quadrillion, and that's why SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, started in the 60s? Because there were so many planets that could support life. We must be able to find life somewhere. Now, there are no longer a quadrillion planets able to support life. There aren't any. Statistically, we can't exist because it's so impossible to have all 200 parameters lined up just the way it's necessary. There must have been somebody fiddling with the controls. Somebody was afoot and changing the way this thing happened in order for life to exist. So just imagine our friend Eckhart, who said, awe and amazement are the most appropriate feelings that you get when you look at life. Imagine how awestruck he would be to know that we have statistically no chance of existing. And it's even more of a miracle that the universe exists. If astrophysicists now tell us that within 1/1,000,000th of a second of the beginning of the Big Bang, there was a perfect ratio between the gravitational force and the strong nuclear force, and that it couldn't be off by more than the tiniest fraction of the tiniest fraction. 1 part per 10 quadrillion. Seriously? That is remotely impossible. And those things had to be just perfect for the universe to even exist in the first place. So the existence of the universe is even a bigger miracle than the existence of life on this planet. So our friend Eckhart would have a wonderful conversation with astrophysicists. One of the most important sayings that Eckhart wrote is, if the only prayer you ever say is thank you, it's enough. His list of aphorisms are just amazing, just absolutely amazing. God is like nothing so much as being itself. God has formed and created the soul very like himself. God is in all creatures. Eckhart was a deep ecologist. He loved all creatures. He said God is in all creatures. God is in everything. He was an exponent of panentheism, which means God is in everything. An interesting comparison is Eckhart's words and teachings bear a remarkable similarity to Black Elk of the Lakota. Guess what? They were both shamans. Eckhart has been described as Hindu by the Hindus, as a Sufi by the Sufis, a shaman by the shamans, and the only Zen thinker in the West by Buddhist scholars. Dr. David Suzuki, a Japanese Buddhist scholar, was having a conversation one day with his friend Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk from Kentucky. And Suzuki said to Merton, he said, Thomas, you are so stuck in Western duality. The only hope you have is to read the only Zen thinker in the West, Meister Eckhart. And Merton said, but Meister Eckhart, he was condemned by the church. I can't do that. And Suzuki said, well, you don't expect me to do anything about that, do you? And indeed, Thomas Merton began to read Eckhart, and it became a central theme of his Christian mysticism. So, this amazing character who lived 700 years ago got himself into hot water with the church. And while they didn't charge him with heresy per se, they suggested that there were a number of his articles that were heretical. And in fact, Pope John the 22nd found that 28 of those articles were in fact to be condemned. Fortunately for Eckhart, that was about a month and a half after he died. So he didn't bother him a lick. It made life difficult for those who came afterwards because Eckhart's sermons were passed around on the QT. You know, they really were not a part of accepted theology in the Catholic Church. So it wasn't until 1850 that the Dominicans actually got around to figuring out that Eckhart had been really a very important part of the world, and they began a movement to have him rehabilitated. And basically they discovered that, well, since he was never really convicted personally of anything, and he had signed a little document that said, well, if I said anything wrong, I recant and I'm sorry. So they said, well, he doesn't really need to be rehabilitated. We'll just bring him back to life. And Meister Eckhart is now recognized as a legitimate speaker of truth. And he's Meister Eckhart, which is German for master, rather than saint, because he got himself in hot water all those years ago. But truly, he was a prophetic, mystic warrior for all time. His 4 E's, ecumenism, ecology, economics, and education, are really important aspects to who we aspire to be. So I invite you to get a hold of anything by Meister Eckhart and read it, because it's a most wonderful exercise in bringing yourself into the realm of spirituality and mysticism. I got a hold of this book by Matthew Fox called Meister Eckhart, and it really sets everything together in a place where you can access it and make sense of it. He actually has Meister Eckhart having conversations with current and previously alive people, so that it's a very interesting thing. There's a conversation between Carl Jung and Meister Eckhart, which obviously couldn't have taken place, but Matthew Fox has written 3 books on Meister Eckhart. So, I commend to you Meister Eckhart. I've always loved the things that I read, but I never knew nearly as much as I do now about who he was, what he really was about, what he was up to, how much he influenced so many people in the world. So, thank you, Meister Eckhart. Now it's open mic time.